All right. James Corbett, welcome to the Dangerous History Podcast. Super happy to have you here. Kind of been a long time coming, but yeah, thanks for taking the time.
No problem, CJ. Good to talk to you again.
So, I was kind of inspired to have you on by finding out that you have, it may not come up in my fake with my fake background doing weird things to me. But you have just in the last month or two, there's your copy not being destroyed by your fake background that you don't have. This book, Reportage. When was it published? Like a couple months ago, something like
Yes,
that.
it was technically published in January. I think I let my listeners know about it in February. I'm going to have the book launch in May, so I'm kind of doing this all the wrong way, but it's my first book, first time I've ever published anything, so just learning
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ropes.
yeah. Well, congratulations. I still have not completed an entire book. I have, a handful of books that I've written chunks of, but I still am trying to overcome my ADD significantly enough to bang out an entire book. But my hat's off to you on that. And yeah, it's a very, very readable, well-written book. I think it's a good one to kind of give to people who are just sort of just starting to use the old cliche, kind of get red pilled or whatever. And it's also very readable. It's almost like you went to school for writing at some point in the distant past.
Indeed. Not only writing, but yes, I took creative writing in my university days and learnt a thing or two about how to write interestingly, but
Mhm.
hopefully also in a way that's straightforward and readable. It's been many years actually of trying to develop a style that is hopefully somewhat entertaining, but also to the point. And it's always a tightrope of that I'm walking with that. And interestingly, since this book was written over the course of 15 years, I think you can see the development of my writing style. The essays are not in chronological order, but I think you might be able to tell which ones were written later and which ones were written earlier by the sort of writing style.
Mhm.
I'll let people
Yeah.
come to their own conclusions and see, and they can ask me if they're right about the chronology of it.
Yeah, so it's a collection of essays that are, on distinct topics, and some of them have a little bit different tone than others. Some are a little bit more humorous, and some are a little bit more serious. But they're unified kind of by this theme of the New World Order, this thing that goes by many names to many people. How would you just sort of summarize like what what the book is and what you were trying to do with the book?
Well, I mean, in a certain way, this is a bit self-serving because I, like yourself, perhaps I like to cover a lot of different subjects. The one thing I hate is having to concentrate on one tiny sliver of thing and become the world expert in that one tiny little area. I like to try to look at big picture and connect things. So the way to do that in when writing a book is essays, and then the essays, yes, as you say, they're all under this sort of general theme, but I can go from topic to topic and cover many different things. So that's what I'm attempting to do. But yes, as the subtitle of the book, as essays on the New World Order would suggest, they are all generally trying to articulate different facets of that New World Order, which I know you know is a phrase with a lot of historical resonance. Going back to Woodrow Wilson and H.G. Wells, and people using it in the early part of the 20th century, and of course, it being used by Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s and their New World Order quest, revivified by Bush after the end of the Cold War and the New World Order that was coming into view at that time. It's a phrase with a lot of historical resonance, and I think it encapsulates a lot of different aspects of the world that we find ourselves in. So, interestingly, although it is essays on the New World Order, I do not actually use that phrase or define that phrase anywhere in the book. I like to think that every essay is contributing towards an understanding of what that means.
Well, that was actually the next thing that I was going to ask you is if you because I kind of struggle with giving very clear but concise definitions for these sorts of things and really this thing that we could call the New World Order or a few other relevant labels for it's so um complicated and multifaceted, and there's different levels within it, and there's also factions within it that don't always agree with each other, and there's often one of the things that turns me off about some people's work in the kind of, for lack of a better term, conspiracy world, or, just alternative media and alternative history, is that some people seem to think that it's more monolithic than I think it really is, where they kind of have a view of it that it doesn't really change over time. And so kind of who the people are and what they're up to. I mean, it's different individuals because, people die and the next generation comes along, but like they're pretty much the same now from what they were 100 years ago in terms of who they are and their ideas. Now, clearly there's continuity as well, but it's not static. And then even within like one given time period, there's
Mm,
factions and
yes. Yep.
there's like, civil wars sort of going on within the elites at various points. So yeah, do
Exactly
you
right.
have any
I agree
thoughts on
very
that?
much with what you're saying there because I call it the comic book conspiracy idea that it's yes it's all this it's a smoky room with 13 people sitting around a table and they're writing the script for everyone on the planet and everyone will follow. I mean that is the cartoon sort of nonsense that leads people to very easily dismiss any sort of alternative recounting of history. Oh, that's just that silly comic book stuff. No, of course, these are people with complex interactions, with their own motivations for being at this table and for negotiating with others within these various groups, and sometimes working with certain groups and sometimes backstabbing each other, etc. Like any human enterprise, there's going to be a lot of back and forth in that regard. But there is historical continuity as well, as you point out. For example, and this is one that always gets me, is that when you look at the ranks of the British Eugenics Society, almost all of the main directors, at least for the first half of the 20th century, all of them were related to Darwin, Galton, Wedgwood in that line somewhere. And I have a list in the book
Oh,
of some of the Leonard Darwin, obviously. Despite having no scientific degree or training, Charles Darwin's son, Leonard, succeeded Francis Galton, his half cousin once removed, as the British Eugenics Society chairman from 1911 to 1928. John Maynard Keynes was president from 37 to 44, as you know. His younger brother married a granddaughter of Charles Darwin. Then there was Charles Galton Darwin, a prominent member of the British Eugenics Society, who was, of course, the grandson of Charles Darwin and obviously named after Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin who invented eugenics, and Julian Huxley from 1959 to 1962. And of course, we know about Huxley and being the grandson of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog.
mhm.
So, I mean, it is there is such obvious nepotism and connection going on, literal family matters, which I guess makes sense when you're talking about eugenicists, for example. Of course, they're going to keep it in the family as much as possible. That's the entire point. But yeah, so there are definitely groups and cliques and families and other things that we can point to, but absolutely there are factions. And the some of the people that I would point to with regard to articulating that, of course, Carol Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American establishment, he paints the picture, of course, of this group that comes together under, well, initially, of course, under Cecil Rhodes, but very quickly it starts to become Milner and Milner's kindergarten, and then the focus of power within that group starts to shift, and they have different ideas. And by the time you get to the 1930s, they're actually fighting with each other over appeasement and what side of that line they're on. So Carol Quigley, for example, shows how groups like that can, yes, certainly wield power and certainly direct things, but it doesn't mean every single member is literally going to be on the exact same page of the exact same script. Another example I would point to was Peter Dale Scott in The Road to 9/11 has a single chapter that in there that really, for whatever reason, really caught my attention when he was talking in the Carter administration about the people who were arguing the different ways of dealing with the Soviet menace, and you had the people who were essentially like Brzezinski and others that were interested in, of course, drawing the Soviets into Afghanistan and laying the trap and draining their blood that way, versus others in the fact in that orbit of the Carter administration who had an opposing point of view. And Peter Dale Scott paints that quite vividly. That no, these are not all every single power player at the seat of power is literally on the same page and literally moving towards the same target, and it's a disservice to the recounting of history if we start to reduce it down to that. I know it's much more appealing. It's much easier. I could have spent, 10 seconds saying, yes, it's all the same group of people and they all want the same thing. But I don't know how much of a accurate map of reality that would be if we reduce it all down to that.
Yeah, I've often thought that, I could have saved myself. I've been doing my podcast for a little bit over a decade now, so, I'm still kind of a newbie compared to you, but Um, I could have saved myself a heck of a lot of time explaining things, a heck of a lot of research time, and probably built a bigger following faster if I didn't have like this compulsive need to actually delve into the accurate complexities and subtleties of, what's really going on. Like it's a lot easier to just have that simple comic book narrative because it's easier for people to glom onto and it seems like a lot of times alternative media figures they'll build a bigger following faster if they jump onto some sort of heuristic
Yeah.
simplified version of things. But since you brought up eugenics, and that was one of the essays in the book that I was the most interested in, just because of my background and what I've studied and covered and whatever. Um, yeah, give us the short version of the origin of eugenics and how it became like one of the centerpieces of the global elites belief system.
Right. Yes. It's an important history and one that we would do well to study in its greater context. And as as we were talking about before we started recording, it's difficult to summarize this in a succinct way. And now I'm going to summarize my summary from the book. But essentially, it is important to put this in the broader historical context because eugenics, specifically under that name and under that title, developed in the late 19th century under Francis Galton. He was the one who coined the term and really got the ball rolling. And there was a group of gentlemen scientists in the late 19th century who were working towards the formulation of that idea and working that out. But I wouldn't say it was essentially a new idea in the late 19th century. I think there's certainly an historical continuity with I put it in the framework of justifications for elite or elitist rule. And there has always been some sort of justification as to why the emperor or the pharaoh or the king has the right to rule over the masses of people. And that concept has evolved over time. And I think of it as iterations of the Matrix. The Matrix keeps rebooting because it has to get more and more refined, essentially, as a mechanism of control over the masses. So, of course, back in the day, just very simple. The Pharaoh is literally God. And so that's why you better do what the Pharaoh says, because he's literally a god. That started to morph as people became perhaps more skeptical as to the divinity of some of these rulers. And by the time you get, for example, the Chinese mandate of heaven is a different concept because the ruler will either enjoy the mandate of heaven, and in which case, okay, so rule is going good. But when things start to fall apart and bad things happen, he has lost the mandate of heaven. Then you have the civil wars and fighting for the new ruler. By the time you get to the European royalty, it's the divine right of kings. God has appointed this family to rule over you, etc. But by the time you get to the 19th century, I mean, come on, we've had the Enlightenment. We're now rational thinkers. There has to be some sort of scientific basis for this, and that's precisely why we start to see the formulation of this pseudo-scientific idea of eugenics, which is based on the idea essentially that there is some fundamental property that propagates from uh, fathers and mothers down to their children that is inherently there are good genes and bad genes. Although interestingly, when eugenics was first coined, Mendelssohn had done his experiments on pea pods at that point, but they weren't well known at that point. So they didn't even really understand the mechanism of heredity at that time. They referred to protoplasm as just some sort of, yeah, I don't know, some sort of gunk that gets passed from generation to generation. Whatever. You know, parents are like children. Children take after their parents. You get the idea. And based on essentially that, they started to decide, well, obviously, look at these wonderful families like, oh, I don't know, the Darwins and the Galtons and the Wedgwoods and all of these wonderful scientists and smart thinkers who come out of these lines. It's because we have better genes. and we're passing this along. And that's why we deserve to be in these positions of power and control and to have wealth. And people who are poor, you see these poor people tend to be, vagrants and itinerant workers. They can't keep a job. They're often criminals. Obviously, it's because they're genes. These are criminal genes, and they get passed along from generation to generation. Of course, completely excluding the social context of where these people are coming from and how they were raised and in what situation and what kind of hand up they got and the nepotism and all of that. Disregard all of that. No, it's just down to the genes. And unfortunately, the logic of such an idea is that, well, if we want to propagate the better kind of human being, we better make sure that the better kind of people have the best opportunities to have big flourishing families, and the poor and the criminals, we got to get rid of them from the gene pool. We've got to start to find ways to get rid of them. And sometimes, of course, that took the very literal turn in the United States with the sterilization laws that were then picked up and literally copied by the Nazis in Nazi Germany. That's where the Nazis got that idea. It was from America after eugenics had been transplanted from Britain to America. So there's a long historical context of this, but essentially it comes down to the idea of how do we justify elite rule of a society? And this is, I would say, this is just the latest iteration of this for the enlightened scientific era. Although I think even eugenics itself has developed over the course of the 20th century. I think it started to morph with the population, the overpopulation, fear mongering of the 1960s. The budding environmental movement became all about carbon dioxide and finding ways to limit and ration carbon as a way of limiting the population. And I think in the 21st century, the new iteration of this is technocracy, that there are
Mm,
technical experts who deserve to rule over society. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with literal heredity of families so much as it
mhm.
is people who have proven their mettle in, well, or elitist organizations of control.
Yeah, whenever I'm talking about eugenics or just talking with somebody who seems to be taking the kind of technocratic stance of, trust the experts. If we could just put the experts in charge with no restrictions on their power, they could solve all of our problems and whatever. Um, I'll point out that if you went back to the early 20th century, say, to the United States, eugenics books that now are laughed off as like crazy racist pseudoscience, those were textbooks in leading American universities. Those were being taught as like the scientific consensus, the science, with a capital S, at Harvard and Princeton and Yale and all these other places, Johns Hopkins. Um, and usually the person who I'm speaking with or speaking to, um, there's somebody that if you just ask them about these ideas, hey, what do you think about racialist eugenics ideas and sterilizing people against their will? All this, they'd be like, oh, that's horrible. That's a dark chapter in our history, whatever. And then they don't seem to want to make the mental connection of, yeah, but that was able to kind of do what it did and be as influential as it was precisely because of the same attitude of technocracy and trust the experts, trust the science. This is the objective eternal truth. And
But
today's
let me
scientific
let
truth
me
is tomorrow's
inject the
joke.
exactly right. No, let me inject the positive side of that because one thing I've noticed, it was interesting to me when I first started the Corbett Report. I was expecting to get a lot of pushback against these crazy 9/11 truth ideas or what have you. It just so happened that I started the Corbett Report at the exact time of a rising tide of alternative media online. And so, in fact, I didn't receive as much of that type of pushback as I expected. But the biggest and strongest pushback I ever received was always on the global warming issue. How can you possibly think that all of these climate scientists, why would they be wrong? How could they possibly do you think they're lying? Do you think they could be motivated by anything other than pure scientific interest, et cetera, et cetera? And it was always very difficult to respond to that because if I responded with the scientific basis of, well, okay, let's look at things like equilibrium climate sensitivity and let's look at the IPCC AR5 and let's look at what they say in figure 13 in this page, and people would get sort of lost in that. No, okay, but no, look on the big scale of things. Do you think they're lying? And so then if I explain, well, okay, I think scientists are motivated by research grants, and I think the research grant funding is actually overwhelmingly on the side of hype and playing these sorts of things up, and you will only get things published if you say this particular phenomenon is due to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And then they'd go back to, well, what about the science itself? So it was this eternal dance of trying essentially to argue people out of the conditioning that they'd been propagandized into all of their lives. And that went on for many years. But I note that in the last few years, I have received a lot less pushback along those lines because suddenly some people, at least people who are of the type who would question, for example, the government and what it has done over the course of, say, the scamdemic, are suddenly starting to realize, hey, you know what? I think maybe scientists can be motivated by something perhaps other than pure scientific rationality and interest.
Hmm.
So I have noticed a bit of a change, and I even have received that feedback very specifically from a few people, one of whom apologized for the way he had
Mm.
talked to me several years ago, now realizing, oh, I think that some of these groups are motivated more by money and other such things. I didn't
Wow.
understand that at the time. So I think there is a
Yeah.
change in public perception happening, and I would sincerely hope that that is enough. It would be very nice if it was enough to derail that technocratic mindset, because certainly people could be railroaded into such an idea of, oh, well, the technical experts, leave it to them. They know what's best. But I think that has been undermined by the fact that trust the science is now a punchline rather than the sort of the gotcha that they expected it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the upsides of the whole COVID, fiasco was that it did seem to awaken more people to the corruption of kind of big pharma and the medical industrial complex in general. But then, like you were saying, just in general, more people are like, huh, maybe there's not such a thing as trustworthy, credentialed, non-biased experts who are genuinely just trying to solve problems with no other ulterior motives. And I've spoken about this and covered this in a bunch of different ways over the course of my work because I spent a lot of time in academia. I was kind of at the fringes at a little podunk college most people have never heard of, but at the same time, like I was in academia. I got, graduate degrees in history. I taught college history for 16 years. And so I saw academia from the inside for a long time. And it became obvious to me, number one, the follow the money idea that if you can control the funding of who gets their research funded, who gets the jobs, who gets the prestigious positions, who gets, in the fanciest journals and whatever, you can easily control like which are the dominant paradigms in a given intellectual field. It's surprisingly not that hard to do. But then second to that is I started to realize that in the structure of academia itself, going back, really to at least the 1880s when kind of modern academia really started to emerge as we know it, in the structure of academia itself, it's built in that there are ideological, um, kind of like just assumed axioms in any field. There are going to be ideological suppositions baked in, and it's not like say the people who are the older academics, the chairman of the departments and the presidents of the universities and the editors of the prestigious journals. It's not like they're sitting down consciously
Mm.
either with themselves or with their colleagues going, all right, so we all are in agreement that we're going to silence this, new theory about our field or this new paradigm that, is going to call into a question they don't have to consciously think about it. Probably most of them don't most of the time. It's just, you can read things like Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions
Yes.
and lots of
Yeah.
other good books about
Right.
like
No, I was just thinking that.
scientism and
Yeah.
yeah, and no, it's actually, academics are as human as anybody else, and they
Mm.
have all the same, motivations, many of them petty, most of them not at all like grand moral or intellectual motivations. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and I saw it myself when I was involved with hiring committees, hiring new faculty members and whatever, where sometimes it was pretty clear to me that somebody who was qualified and seemed like they might be able to do a good job was not going to get offered a job simply because something they had said or something on their CV that indicated ideological nonconformity or excessive independent thought. And frankly, I a lot of times look back and was like, man, how the hell did I slip under the radar and get in here?
Yeah.
But somehow I did. But that kind of imagine that kind of thing just happening countless times constantly in, every university and whatever. And it's like it's not that hard. Um, because it's kind of like a self-policing, self-correcting thing in the structure of academia. And that's just as true in history or economics as it might be in
Yeah.
psychiatry or medicine or
Right.
nutrition or, any of a number of.
What's the old phrase they use? Scientific progress happens one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, that's the real structure of scientific revolution is just eventually old ideas will die out and finally new ideas can arise. And
Yeah.
hopefully that does lead to actual progress of some sort, but not necessarily, I suppose, again, depending on the types of structures that are in place to incentivize and reward various types of thinking. And if there is a technocratic, centralized power sort of mindset that is funding the research and giving the grants and holding the positions in institutions and the membership of various clubs and associations, etc., then unfortunately that idea is going to propagate into the future. And
Yeah.
it that really does, of course, pose the question to people who are interested in, say, decentralizing power and
Mm.
individual freedom, etc. Well, then what can we do to incentivize that? And
Hmm.
unfortunately, a lot of us are not in a position to be able to fund some sort of, incredible research projects and members, large membership institutions and what have you. So we have to find other ways of trying to build that up from the bottom up rather than from the top
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. I mean, I've from the beginning, I've kind of thought of and talked of, what I'm trying to do as guerrilla intellectual warfare, as, like I'm just one guy with a shoestring budget and, some extra time on my hands and I've read too many books or whatever. And it's like, all right, I guess I'll go up against the American Historical Association and, all the Ivy League universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments. All right, I'm just some guy. And, as much as Douglas Murray might want people like me to not be allowed to speak publicly about things, I'll go ahead and do it anyway until they make me
Well, why
stop.
not? Hey, let me turn the tables on you and ask you a question because this is something that I've definitely talked about and referenced before. For example, I'm going to say off the top of my head, I might be wrong, episode 350 one of the Corbett Report podcast question mark is history by the winners. It's about that
Mm,
concept of how history is written and
mm,
where the textbooks come from and how they shape and mold generations of thinkers. And I specifically incite in that, as I have several other times, the testimony of Norman Dodd, researcher for the
mm,
Reese Commission. I'm sure you're familiar with that story.
mm.
How much credence do you give to the Reese Commission and its findings about what they found in the early 20th century with regards to the foundations and how they set out to monopolize the teaching of history in America?
Oh, I think that there's even more to it, than the Dodd Commission was able to cover, in that short amount of time and everything with whatever resources he had. But yeah, I mean, my own, and I still would like to look more into this stuff, but what I have looked into has convinced me that corporate foundations and then just sort of NGOs in general, right, as we've seen with some of the Doge revelations, like whatever the ulterior motives are for revealing that stuff, it's still those are important, like mind-blowing revelations to anyone who's paying attention to them because it confirms what a lot of us already kind of knew from bits and pieces here and there and sort of pieced together forensically. But yeah, the corporate foundations were huge. The Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford foundations, and then some later ones, in our time. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is another big one. And then there's a lot of other ones that are smaller that are not, anywhere near as big as say the Rockefeller Foundation, but they still have an impact. Like if you watch any PBS
Mhm.
history documentary, some of which are
Mhm.
pretty good, by the way. They're
Mhm.
they're 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 usually better than History Channel stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but they'll only go up to a point with certain things. So like PBS, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever, put out that eugenics documentary, and actually a lot of it was pretty good. Then, but there were just certain things they didn't quite follow, as far as they could have. You could tell there was a little bit of like hitting the brakes on some things. But if you pay attention to any of those PBS documentaries at the end when they're talking about like funding or whatever, sometimes they do it at the beginning. It's like, oh yes, the so and so and such foundation, and the this and that foundation. And then this is all stuff you can just Google. Like, who is this, person's last name I've never heard of foundation? And you find out, oh, he's some oligarch that maybe wasn't quite at the Rockefeller level, but he was pretty damn huge. And, he left a ton of his money to fund, um, propaganda of various sorts or research of various sorts and things like this. So yeah, and really, and I already kind of understood this, but watching the way that the whole like COVID insanity broadly defined, like not just the virus itself and the immediate stuff to it, but the entire situation and the way it was managed and the way it unfolded. Um, that and again, I think this is something that's starting to a lot of people are starting to kind of wake up to a little bit more. Is that this idea that there's the public sector, the government, the state, and then there's the private sector, corporations, and that they're like these totally separate spheres. And a lot of
Even battling each other. They're
oh
kind of opposed,
yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah,
Right, right.
and I consider myself some kind of like vaguely defined small L libertarian and whatever, but I think a lot of what I would call, for lack of a better term, blue pilled libertarians, um, they still think in these terms. They still think in
Mm,
terms of like private company, good,
mm.
government bad. And yeah, I mean, when you look
Private corporate
into
foundation, good. The
yeah,
Rockefellers did a lot of good for humanity.
yeah,
Mm,
must be good, and
mm,
and totally not understanding
mm,
the truth that like big corporations and the modern highly centralized state, like they've been
mm.
wedded at the hip and they
Yes.
kind of emerge together with lots of personnel overlap and lots of
Hmm.
like one of the first people I read that really made me think about this in clearer terms was John Taylor Gatto, actually,
Mm.
um, writing about how these foundations set up American schooling and things like this. And
I could take this
and
from a completely different perspective because I just did an interview about a video that I released 6 years ago on the secrets of Silicon Valley, and in recent reading, revisiting that material for that interview, I once again it brought back to mind all of the research I've done to show that in a very key sense, Silicon Valley and the big tech companies are the military and intelligence agencies. The military and intelligence agencies
mm,
are big tech. There is so much overlap, not only in personnel, but in funding, investment, in associations, in grants, and all sorts of things, contracts. There's so much overlap that at a certain point you can't tell where government ends and these big tech companies begin, and that's just another aspect of this exact same phenomenon.
yeah. And you talk a lot about various points in the book, but especially in your chapter Up Down Politics, which was another one of my favorite ones. The phoniness of the left right paradigm that us in the cheap seats are supposed to be just obsessed with and think that's all the be all end all of everything to understanding the world is left versus right politics. Um, it's always seemed to me that the they each can correctly identify half the problem. So let's say like let's say a good left winger, like one who's not just a complete stooge for the establishment, but does have some genuine, good motives and does have some legit populist sympathies and whatever. But they're likely to only see the negatives of the corporations, but then still have this sanctified view of the state that it's always, looking out for the common good. And if we could just give it more power at the expense of the corporations, it's going to solve all our problems. And then on the blue pilled right, you've got the opposite where they correctly identify a lot of the evils of the state, although they usually have a blind spot for the military and
Yeah,
intelligence and law enforcement, we should point out.
yeah.
But they will often now this more of them I think are starting to wake up in recent years with all the COVID stuff, but they often will have a blind spot for the evils of big corporations, and they'll think like, no, those are private
Well,
companies. I believe in the market. That's free market right there, and so
exactly. So
they're good.
we're talking in the classical sense of what we have throughout our lifetimes anyway understood as the left and right positions. But the fact that that has changed, demonstrably, markedly changed, specifically in the past decade, actually points to an even deeper underlying phenomenon. Because it's a point that James Evan Pilato, I do New World Next Week with him every week. He talks about it quite a bit. Back a decade plus ago, he was going on, marches against Monsanto with his fellow, usually left wingers from Portland, marching against the man, and identified GMO as a problem, identified, these threats to health, etc. Fast forward a decade, and now those same people are literally cutting people out of their lives because they won't take the medical interventions by these big pharma companies. And these are the same people who say back in 2019, or sorry, 2020, going into 2021, I don't know, I'd be very skeptical and hesitant to take a vaccine from this Trump administration. But then as soon as Biden comes in, couldn't get it in their arms quick enough.
Mhm.
That kind of flip. And then on the other side, yes, the traditionally people on the right have been pro corporate, pro business, whatever, public companies, yeah, yeah, yeah. But now we're starting to see this flip with Maha and other such things, where now it's becoming this Republican right wing stance to be against big pharma and some of these companies. So think that this entire complete pole shift has happened, and we're still referring to left and right, clearly shows there is something fundamentally broken with the way that we're trying to conceive of these political positions. And that's really the point of up down politics that I'm trying to make. Left and right, there is a sense in which there is left and right, but if we exclude up and down, then we cannot make sense of the political universe we're living in, because the entirety, I would say, of the elitist propagandist forces are trying to get us to go in the up direction. Up left, up right, up center, whatever. Who cares? As long as it's up towards authoritarian centralization of power and control. And there may be some opposition that comes from whichever team is out of political office at the moment, but that will only last until they're in office, in which case, of course, they'll be 100% back on board with the authoritarian agenda. And until we realize that aspect of the game that's being played, well, we're going to lose that game.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it is a deliberate kind of divide and rule strategy, as you cover in Up Down Politics. And I thought your example that you used there, which I've used before on my podcast, and even when I was teaching college history classes, is the kind of stuff I would sneak below the radar into a college classroom. Um, but comparing and contrasting the Tea Party with Occupy Wall Street, and how they actually had a lot in common, including the way that ultimately they both kind of ended.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
so could you talk a little bit about
Yes.
that and what that illustrates?
To me, that was formative because it happened around the time when I was starting my podcast. So I watched the development of both of these movements. The Tea Party, although people do not remember it anymore, the Tea Party actually developed from a 9/11 truth uh, idea about the Boston Tea Party. But so there was a Boston 9/11 truth group that marched to throw copies of the 9/11 Commission report in the harbor. So that was where the Tea Party actually originated from. It was heavily associated with the Ron Paul campaign, 2008, etc. But then, and so when the 2008 financial crisis happened, and we started to have mammoth populist protest against the bankster bailout. Remember when the $700 billion bailout was such an unbelievably huge number? We'd never heard numbers like this before. It's insane. Why are we bailing out the bankers? Of course, that ultimately went up to, what was it, 21 trillion or whatever the ultimate price tag on those bailouts ended up being. And can you tell us where the money went? No, I can't, said Bernanke during his testimony in front of Congress. But anyway, that was obviously this incredible populist movement that was happening. And the Tea Party, of course, got associated with the right end of the political spectrum. You had Occupy, which came up in 2011, right? Was when it started. And
Something like that.
similarly, against the 1%, identifying the 1%, the elitists, the banksters, and those that they had in their pockets in government. obviously against the bailouts and the never-ending support to Wall Street. And so there was definitely the kernel of both of these ideas was essentially the same idea, the same populist sentiment. Hey, it's them versus us. But that is the one thing that I think actually truly frightens the oligarchs at this stage is, uh-oh, our divide and rule isn't working so well anymore. And I think, and I don't have the receipts on this yet. I need to do, I guess, a deep dive, true exploration of this. But I think that it is no coincidence that from the point at which Occupy and the Tea Party both got basically taken over by the mainstream political establishment and became Democrat and Republican, divide and rule once again. And from that point, the entire cultural political conversation has been centered around the culture wars. Now it is all about, what kind of bathroom you go to and all of those types of issues. Now
Yeah.
suddenly, where are we talking about banks and bankers and bailouts and all that kind of stuff? Who cares? Now it's
Yep.
all about the culture wars. And I think there must be some sort of relation as to how that conversation got seeded into the public consciousness.
I definitely think you're right. I mean, you've probably seen some of those memes that really illustrate the truth, very boom, where they'll show, the offices of JP Morgan on Wall Street, say like 2011 or something, and it's all these Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. We're coming for the bankers, whatever. And then the bottom half of the meme will be a photo of that same place a few years later, and it's like, Black Lives Matter, gay pride flags, or whatever, one of those things. And it's like, oh, okay. And it provided a basically free way for those horrible oligarchical corporations to get free virtue points. All they have to do is like put a pride flag out during Pride Month, and it's like, hey, forget that I'm taking people's homes and ripping people off and getting bailed out by your tax dollars. I've got a pride flag, so I'm on the progressive side of things. And I've also seen where like LexisNexis and things like that will show that prior to Occupy Wall Street, in major media outlets, there was just not a lot of coverage of these culture war issues. And then all of a sudden, it goes from like a handful a year of covering these things to like constant. And so, this can't be a coincidence. And yeah, I mean, when you look at the way that wokeism, for lack of a better term, has been embraced by the biggest corporations in the world and also by institutions like the CIA,
Mhm.
and the Pentagon and these sorts of things. And yet there's still, some random left-wing young person in Portland who thinks like they're fighting the system by espousing the same things that are on the CIA's website in terms of DEI and whatever. It's just um, insane. Um, I did want to circle back. I know we're running up against the clock soon here. There was something I wanted to follow up on but forgot before, in regard to eugenics. Just because that's a particular interest of mine, and I know a lot of my audience too. Um, Eugenics in its origin was very Anglo-Saxonist. It was very, not just against people with like disabilities and handicaps and even just sometimes poor people or whatever, but it was explicitly Anglo-Saxonist. It had a whole racial hierarchy. As I know, they didn't even just think in terms of like white people, black people.
Mhm.
They thought in terms of like many different layers even of white people, and they're not all equal, and there's a hierarchy, and the Southern Europeans are lower down. And
Mhm.
um, what do you think happened to the Anglo-Saxonist streak in eugenics as eugenics kind of morphed
Mhm.
into its current form? I know
Mhm.
the current form of eugenics is usually not explicitly racial,
Mhm.
and they usually don't even use the term eugenics because they don't want to be
Mhm.
associated with that history. Um,
Social demography or whatever they talk about these days. Yeah.
yeah, they got their different euphemisms.
Mhm.
Do you think that at the end of it though, like if you went all the way to the top, um, so to speak, do you think that they still hold to these Anglo-Saxonist
Mhm.
ideas, or do you think that they've kind of like morphed into a multiracial eugenics idea where, within
Mhm.
different ethnic
Yeah.
groups there are still like elite people that we can we
Mhm.
can maybe bring into our club as new members or whatever?
Right.
Um, or are they still, when you get to a certain level, are they still old school Anglo-Saxonist?
I would say that I would approach this in the same way I would approach the question, for example, of secret societies and the secret religion and Freemasonry and things like this. The question always comes back to, do you think these people really believe that kind of stuff? Or are they just using it as a sort of tool of control over upcoming would-be members of the elite? No, in order to get into our circles, you have to lie in the coffin and masturbate and talk about your fantasies and all of this. Like, oh, this is just what you do at Yale.
Honesman,
If you
all
want to
here.
join the club, right? So,
Mhm.
do they really believe in this occult power or whatever, or are they just using it as a tool of control? Maybe both. I'm sure there are true believers within the ranks who really do believe in things like that, as well as things like for example, the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race and what have you. And I think there are others who use it cynically as essentially a tool of control, which is precisely why eugenics has taken that turn that now includes more women, and you'll find in the ranks of what remains of the eugenics societies, they've all changed their names as we've pointed out, but the ones that exist to this day, oh, I can't even keep track of the name of the Galton Institute, which now has changed its name to something else and blah, blah, blah. But now it's women and racial minorities and other such things. What? How on earth is there continuity there? Isn't it, as you say, it was about not only white, it was about specifically Anglo-Saxons, right? I'm sure there are still those who really do believe in that particular flavor of it, but there are others who are just using it as, again, the justification for elitist rule. And in that sense, it may be more valuable to bring in some of these people who would otherwise be excluded from the circles, to bring them in to use them and employ their services. I mean, I don't know, like a Brzezinski or people like this are not necessarily part of that clique that would be part of the inner eugenics circles, but maybe usable by people of that sort who need someone like that as the middleman gopher. And so you're not going to exclude people who wouldn't be part of the inner circle. You're going to make use of them. And I think that's, to me, it's a sort of a cynical ploy. Having said that, yes, I'm sure there are still absolute true believers in the core of this, and scrape the surface of any eugenicist. And it's funny how quickly you will start to see suddenly the stratification of different classes of white people coming to the fore once again. It's like, well, we don't mean those Italians. They're not really white. And Irish, come
Mhm.
on. That sort of thing is just right there below the surface.
Yeah, and in the US, even with old school eugenics, but definitely um, today as well, there's even an extremely strong classist element
Mm,
too, where when an old school eugenicist says, "Oh, I think white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are superior," they didn't mean impoverished people in Appalachia
yeah,
who might
yeah.
technically also be white Anglo-Saxon. Like they still look down on those people and stereotype them as, scummy rednecks and whatever. And the funny part is that's one of the stereotypes and hatreds that's still not only allowed but often encouraged in mainstream discourse today, where, you can't say horrible things about, black people or Mexicans or whoever, but you can still talk about, some poor redneck in Kentucky with like absolute hatred and contempt and condescension and say horrible things about him. And that's fine. So there's this continuity of like this like uh specter of the redneck or something like this.
Mhm.
Well, I know we're running up against the clock. There's a ton of other things I'd love to ask you about related to this book and your work in general. But just one more I'll throw out there, and maybe it'll put you on the spot a little bit. But I'm just curious, since this book is in some ways kind of a retrospective of your
Mhm.
career up till now, which you've been doing this a long time.
Mhm.
You're one of the kind of OGs of this kind of work. Um, can you think of anything like significant issues or phenomena that you've studied or things where your take on it, your understanding of it, how you think about it has changed
Mm,
significantly
mm,
from when you were starting the Corbett
mm.
report in your early years to now? Is there anything where you look
Yes,
back and like I'm totally different in how I view that?
absolutely. Well, I would say, for example, the spontaneous order essay would not
Mm,
have come through in the way that it did if I wrote it when I started out on this project in 2009, for example. I mean, my entire understanding of the political world has changed drastically from 2009 in terms of, uh, interestingly, I do believe Up Down Politics was one of those essays that at least the kernel of which started in 2009. So I think I've
Mm.
had that concept for a long time, but I framed it more specifically in a sort of a libertarian, maybe even capital L libertarian party kind of way when I originally understood that. But my understanding of the political system and dynamics and bringing individual freedom down to the individual is definitely, I'd say, the key part of my political transformation over the past decade and a half. And that informs everything that I do and everything I think. As I say in, I think, the forward to this book, um, back in 2009, I was apt to tell people to, write their member of parliament and, be part of the political process. Vote third party, guys. That's how we're going to get out of this mess. I would not advocate for that as a solution, at least as a thoroughgoing solution to our problems today, because I realize it's much deeper than that. And the political process itself, the political system itself, the idea of political authority itself is inherently illegitimate. And until we completely reject that idea, I don't think we're going to escape some of these problems. So that is, I would say, the biggest issue on which I've had a very, very drastic sea change of opinion. On every other issue, certainly my understanding, I would say, has
Yeah,
grown
you'll
over
learn
the
more.
past 15 years of
Yeah.
research, but my perspective has completely changed on the political issue in particular.
Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to keep talking with you, but I know you've got to run, go do another show or what have you, and so yeah. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. Kind of an honor. You're one of the sort of OGs in this world that I'm kind of like a middle G in now at this
Mhm.
point, I guess. But the book is Reportage, very much worth reading. Highly recommend it. And anyone who's not familiar with James, check him out. Corbett Report, corbettreport.com, all that good stuff. James, thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, CJ. I always appreciate it. Let's do it again.
Yeah,